The late December disclosures about Russia's possible assistance to North Korea in building its first nuclear-powered submarine are not an isolated revelation, they are a symptom of a deeper structural shift in the international security environment shaped by prolonged war, sanctions pressure, and the erosion of long-standing norms. What appears on the surface as a bilateral act of military cooperation is, in fact, the visible intersection of two battlefields that are geographically distant but strategically intertwined, the war in Ukraine and the militarization of Northeast Asia. For Moscow, the war in Ukraine has evolved from a campaign of rapid coercion into a grinding conflict of attrition. Sustaining this war has forced the Kremlin to search beyond traditional partners for manpower, munitions, and political support. North Korea, long isolated and accustomed to operating under extreme sanctions, represents a uniquely compatible partner in this environment. Pyongyang can provide what Russia increasingly lacks: artillery shells, rockets, and potentially even troops, without domestic political constraints or concern for reputational costs. In return, Russia can offer what North Korea has struggled for decades to obtain: advanced military technology that accelerates its strategic weapons programs. The reported assistance in constructing a nuclear-powered submarine, if accurate, signals a qualitative leap in this exchange. A completed and welded hull implies not merely technical consultation but deep involvement in reactor integration, metallurgy, and naval propulsion, areas tightly controlled even among established nuclear powers. Such assistance would not be driven by ideological alignment but by wartime necessity. Russia's calculus appears transactional and short-term, offset immediate battlefield shortages in Ukraine by leveraging expertise accumulated during the Soviet and post-Soviet era. Yet this logic underestimates the long-term strategic consequences of empowering a state whose security doctrine is built on brinkmanship and escalation. Simultaneously, events on the Ukrainian front underscore the moral and political framing Moscow has chosen to accompany its military strategy. The Christmas Day aerial bomb strikes on civilian areas in Zaporizhia, Chernihiv, Kherson, and other cities are not militarily decisive actions, they are instruments of psychological pressure and political signaling. By rejecting even symbolic ceasefire proposals and continuing attacks on religious holidays, the Kremlin reinforces a narrative of total war, one that dismisses humanitarian norms as irrelevant constraints. This posture aims to convey resolve, but it also reveals a structural weakness. Russia's limited ability to translate battlefield violence into strategic breakthroughs has pushed it toward coercion of civilian populations as a substitute for operational success. These parallel developments, Russia's outreach to North Korea and its intensification of strikes against Ukrainian civilians, share a common origin. Both reflect a state under pressure, adapting by widening the conflict's diplomatic and ethical boundaries rather than narrowing its objectives. The war has forced Moscow into a position where escalation abroad and brutality at home become mutually reinforcing tools. In doing so, Russia is reshaping not only the trajectory of the Ukraine conflict but also the security calculations of regions far beyond Eastern Europe, laying the groundwork for consequences that will unfold over years rather than months. Russia's deepening engagement with North Korea is not merely an act of opportunism, it is a byproduct of systemic strain. Sanctions have narrowed Moscow's access to advanced components, global finance, and flexible logistics. Over time, these constraints erode not only material capacity but also strategic choice. The Kremlin's increasing reliance on pariah states is therefore less a sign of strength than an admission that conventional avenues of power projection have been severely degraded. North Korea, for its part, approaches this exchange with a long-term strategic horizon. Pyongyang's leadership understands that nuclear weapons alone do not guarantee survivability. Credible second-strike capability is the missing pillar of its deterrence architecture. A nuclear-powered submarine, particularly one capable of carrying strategic guided missiles, addresses this vulnerability directly. Unlike land-based launchers, such a platform complicates enemy detection, disperses risk, and elevates North Korea from a regional disruptor to a more enduring strategic actor. Russian technical assistance, even if limited, accelerates this transformation by compressing decades of trial and error into a much shorter timeline. This asymmetry of time horizons is critical. Russia trades expertise accumulated over generations for short-term wartime relief. North Korea converts that expertise into structural gains that will outlast the Ukraine war itself. The imbalance suggests a strategic miscalculation in Moscow's approach. While Russia seeks to survive the present, it may be underwriting a future security environment that is less predictable and more hostile, particularly for its own far eastern flank. Meanwhile, the continued targeting of Ukrainian civilians during symbolic moments such as Christmas serves a dual function. Domestically, it reinforces a narrative of existential struggle, justifying prolonged sacrifice and suppressing dissent. Internationally, it tests the resilience of Western political cohesion by probing moral fatigue. Yet these attacks also expose a structural weakness in Russia's military campaign, the inability to decisively break Ukrainian resistance on the battlefield. When operational momentum stalls, violence against civilian infrastructure becomes a surrogate for strategic progress, even as it hardens international resolve against Moscow. The reactions from Washington, where U.S. senators publicly labeled Vladimir Putin a ruthless murderer, illustrate how these actions reshape diplomatic space. Such language, while rhetorical, narrows the possibilities for negotiated compromise and entrenches a moral framing of the conflict. Once a war is widely cast as a struggle against barbarism rather than a contest of interests, off-ramps become politically costly for all sides. This dynamic serves Ukraine's case for continued support but also locks the conflict into a longer, more polarized trajectory. The emerging Russia-North Korea axis and the continued escalation of violence in Ukraine point toward a future defined less by resolution than by diffusion. The immediate battlefield outcomes may remain uncertain, but the strategic consequences are already taking shape. What began as a regional war is hardening into a structural driver of global instability, reshaping deterrence dynamics, alliance behavior, and the rules that govern military conduct. In the medium term, the most likely scenario is one of managed but persistent escalation. Russia, constrained by sanctions and attrition, will continue to externalize the costs of its war by deepening ties with states willing to trade material support for strategic technology or political backing. This pattern may extend beyond North Korea, reinforcing a loose network of revisionist actors bound not by ideology but by shared hostility toward the Western-led order. Ukraine, meanwhile, will remain the central testing ground for endurance. Its survival will depend on sustained Western assistance, while Russia will rely on coercive tactics and incremental gains rather than decisive breakthroughs. Under this scenario, civilian populations remain exposed, and humanitarian norms continue to erode as instruments of war. In Northeast Asia, the implications are more destabilizing over the long term. A credible North Korean nuclear-powered submarine force would alter the strategic calculus of South Korea, Japan, and the United States. Even a small number of such platforms would complicate missile defense planning, strain early warning systems, and intensify debates over extended deterrence. This, in turn, could accelerate regional militarization, greater investment in anti-submarine warfare, expanded intelligence sharing, and renewed domestic discussions in Seoul and Tokyo about their own strategic options. The result would be a more heavily armed and less forgiving security environment, where miscalculation carries higher stakes. For Russia itself, the long-term outlook is paradoxical. By leveraging military technology as currency, Moscow preserves its ability to fight today but diminishes its strategic leverage tomorrow. Empowering North Korea with advanced capabilities undermines Russia's claim to be a stabilizing power in Asia and risks creating a more volatile neighbor with limited incentives to align with Russian interests once the transactional exchange has run its course. At the same time, the reputational damage inflicted by attacks on civilians, particularly during religious holidays, will linger, constraining Russia's diplomatic rehabilitation even if the war in Ukraine eventually freezes or de-escalates. At the global level, these dynamics signal a weakening of the post-Cold War security architecture. The normalization of technology transfers that were once taboo, the instrumentalization of civilian suffering, and the erosion of ceasefire traditions all point to a harsher international system. Power is increasingly exercised through endurance and disruption rather than consensus and restraint. In such an environment, conflicts become more interconnected, and local wars generate strategic aftershocks far beyond their immediate geography. Ultimately, the convergence of Russia's war in Ukraine and North Korea's strategic ambitions illustrates a defining feature of the current era: wars no longer remain where they begin. They travel through supply chains, technology transfers, and political narratives, reshaping regions that appear, at first glance, unrelated. The decisions made in Moscow, Kiev, and Pyongyang today will therefore shape not only the outcome of a single conflict, but the contours of global security for years to come.